What would you do if you had 10,000 men and 100,000 soldiers were marching straight toward your doorstep? Think about that for a second. 10-to-1 odds, no reinforcements coming, no allies willing to risk their necks, just you, your people, and an army so massive it stretches beyond the horizon. Most rulers would surrender, sign whatever treaty keeps their head attached to their body, pay whatever price buys another year of breathing. That's the smart move, right? That's survival. But in 1462, one man looked at those impossible odds and made a different choice. He decided that if he couldn't beat the largest military force on Earth, he would break something inside them instead, something that couldn't be repaired with reinforcements or fresh supplies. He would break their minds. And what happened next? It would haunt soldiers for the rest of their lives. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand the world in 1462. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just powerful, it was unstoppable. Less than a decade earlier, they had accomplished the unthinkable. Constantinople, the city that had defined Christian civilization for over 1,000 years, had fallen. The greatest walls in the known world couldn't stop them. The most legendary defenses humanity had ever built crumbled under Ottoman cannon fire. Sultan Mehmed II was barely in his 20s when he took that city. Young, brilliant, absolutely ruthless, and completely convinced that history was moving in one direction only, forward, under his control. From the coasts of modern-day Turkey to the mountains of the Balkans, resistance was collapsing like dominoes. One kingdom after another bent the knee. Princes who valued their heads negotiated tribute arrangements. Gold and silver flowed south to Ottoman coffers. The message was crystal clear. You could submit, or you could be erased. The Danube River marked the northern edge of this expanding empire, not because the Ottomans couldn't cross it, but because they hadn't felt the need to yet. The small principality on the other side already paid tribute. It already sent hostages to the Ottoman court as guarantees of good behavior. It was already obedient. That principality was Wallachia, and its rulers had survived for decades by understanding one fundamental truth. You don't win wars against the Ottomans. You survive them. You smile when commanded. You pay when demanded. You send your sons to live as prisoners in gilded cages so everyone knows you'll behave. Then Vlad III took power. See, Vlad had grown up in that Ottoman court. He'd spent years as a hostage himself, watching, learning, absorbing everything about how the empire operated. Its discipline, its methods, its expectations. He understood Ottoman power better than most Ottoman generals did. And he understood something else just as clearly. This arrangement of survival through submission, it wasn't safety, it was slow surrender. Every year of tribute was another link in a chain. Every hostage was another generation raised to accept servitude as normal. So Vlad did something that made every diplomat in Eastern Europe choke on their wine. He stopped paying. He refused to send hostages. Then, just to make absolutely certain the message was received, he started attacking Ottoman outposts south of the Danube. Small raids, hit and run, nothing that looked like conquest, just defiance. Loud, public, unmistakable defiance. Now, put yourself in Mehmed's position. You've just conquered the unconquerable city. You've built a reputation as the man who breaks the unbreakable. And some minor prince in some forgettable territory is openly mocking your authority. What happens if you let this slide? Every nervous vassal watching starts to wonder if maybe Ottoman power isn't quite as absolute as it seems. Every border that currently bows starts to stiffen. The illusion of inevitability, which is honestly your greatest weapon, begins to crack. Mehmed's response was exactly what you'd expect. This wasn't going to be a measured response. This was going to be a demonstration. He assembled an army of nearly 100,000 soldiers, infantry, cavalry, engineers, artillery, cannon that had shattered Constantinople's walls, supply trains organized to sustain a deep march into enemy territory. The orders were simple: remove Vlad, install someone obedient, restore the natural order of things. From Mehmed's perspective, the outcome was already written. Wallachia couldn't resist. It didn't have the manpower. It didn't have the wealth. It certainly didn't have anything that could stand against the full might of the Ottoman war machine in open battle. This campaign would be quick, decisive, almost routine. But here's the thing Mehmed didn't fully understand. Vlad had no intention of meeting him in open battle. He was preparing something else entirely. The moment Vlad confirmed the size of the force moving against him, he accepted a brutal truth most leaders refuse to face. He could not win a single direct engagement. Not one. His entire army would be surrounded and crushed in an afternoon if he tried. Even hiding behind fortress walls offered no real protection. Those walls would fall. They always fell against Ottoman siege equipment. So he made a decision that would define the entire campaign. If he couldn't win the kind of war his enemy was prepared for, he would force them to fight a completely different kind of war. One where their advantages meant nothing. Weeks before the Ottoman columns reached Wallachian territory, Vlad's men were already at work. They studied every road an army of that size would have to use. The paths wide enough for wagons, river crossings sturdy enough to support artillery, routes that avoided swamps and thick forests. Then they began emptying those routes of everything useful. Villages along the march were cleared, not in panic, under control. Families left with what they could carry. Everything else was removed or destroyed. Grain was hauled north or burned where it stood. Livestock was driven away, mills were smashed. Nothing remained that could feed 100,000 hungry mouths. The wells came last. Some were poisoned, others were filled with dirt or dead animals. A soldier who finds a rotting carcass in a well doesn't drink, no matter how desperate the thirst. Bridges were sabotaged, not completely destroyed. That would just force the Ottomans to find alternate routes. Damaged just enough that heavy wagons and cannon had to cross one at a time. Every crossing became a bottleneck. Every bottleneck meant stopping, waiting, losing time. And an army that keeps stopping becomes tired. Tired soldiers become careless soldiers. Meanwhile, Vlad broke his own forces into pieces. No grand army would stand together waving banners. Instead, small mounted groups, sometimes just a few dozen riders each, scattered across the countryside. These weren't professional soldiers in the traditional sense. These were men who'd grown up in this terrain, who knew which forests swallowed sound, which hills hid movement until the last possible second, which marshes looked solid but would swallow a horse to its belly. Their orders weren't heroic. They were practical. Don't hold ground. Don't chase glory. Don't seek large battles. Strike only when escape is guaranteed. Then vanish. Ottoman scouts pushing ahead of the main force began dying. Messengers between units stopped arriving. Foraging parties sent to find food disappeared without a trace. At night, supply wagons burned. Not in dramatic waves. One here, two there. Just enough that no one ever felt safe. These attacks followed a pattern designed to maximize psychological damage. A patrol enters a forest road. Arrows strike from both sides simultaneously. Horses scream. The fight lasts 15 seconds. By the time reinforcements arrive, the attackers are gone. All that remains are bodies and silence. Day after day, the physical toll accumulated. Soldiers marched longer routes because familiar roads kept turning into ambushes. They slept in armor because attacks came at any hour. Food became scarce. Water couldn't be trusted. Feet blistered. Horses weakened. Wounds festered in the summer heat. And then came the stories. This is where Vlad's genius shifted from military to psychological. He understood that exhaustion alone wouldn't break an army this disciplined. He needed something else. Something that lived in the imagination. When patrols were ambushed, not everyone was killed. One or two men were always allowed to escape. They staggered back to camp, shaken pale, struggling to form words. And the details they shared began spreading through the ranks like infection. They said they weren't just attacked. They were hunted. Prisoners weren't simply killed. They were kept waiting. Long enough to understand exactly what was about to happen to them. And then there were the bodies. Found at crossroads. Set upright on stakes. Arranged deliberately so no one could pass without seeing. No one knew how much of this was true. That uncertainty was the point. A soldier who believes capture means quick death can still fight bravely. A soldier who believes capture means something worse, that soldier starts imagining, and imagination follows him everywhere. When he stands guard at midnight, when he drinks from a well that looks clean, when he falls just a few steps behind on the march. Fear doesn't shout, it whispers. As the Ottoman army pushed deeper into Wallachia, something fundamental began shifting. The land offered nothing. The enemy refused to stand and fight, and the consequences of being caught became too terrible to contemplate clearly. Vlad watched all of this carefully. His scouts studied the Ottoman camps as they formed each night. They tracked guard rotations. They noted which units relaxed first after long marches. They observed where confidence replaced caution. He wasn't planning a battle. He was waiting for a specific moment, when exhaustion and routine and suppressed fear all converged at once. Because when certainty disappears, even the mightiest army becomes vulnerable. That moment came on a night when the Ottoman forces had finally stopped for extended rest. Tents rose in disciplined rows across a wide plain. Fires flickered. Food was prepared. Armor was loosened. For the first time in weeks, soldiers allowed themselves to believe they might sleep through the night without waking to screams. From the Ottoman perspective, this pause made sense. The harassment had seemed to thin. Wallachia appeared to be running out of strength. The worst was surely over. This was exactly what Vlad had been waiting for. He didn't attack when the Ottomans were alert. He didn't attack when fear was fresh and sharp. He attacked when exhaustion had dulled every instinct. Shortly after midnight, Wallachian riders approached the camp without torches, without noise, moving slowly enough to pass for normal activity in the darkness. Some wore Ottoman clothing stripped from previous ambushes, not disguises that would survive close inspection, just enough to create a second of hesitation from tired sentries who saw shapes moving in the dark among thousands of other shapes. They passed the outer perimeter, then the second ring, deeper into the camp where tents clustered close together, where the heart of the army slept. Every step now was calculated risk. A single shout could collapse everything. The tension must have been unbearable. And then, fire. Torches arced through darkness and landed on canvas. Flames exploded across dry fabric. At the same moment, horses were cut loose from their lines. They bolted in panic, crashing through ropes and tent poles, trampling men still tangled in sleep. The camp detonated into chaos. Soldiers woke choking on smoke, reaching for weapons they couldn't locate. Officers screamed orders that collided with contradictory orders. Units stumbled into each other in the darkness, unable to tell friend from enemy. Shadows moved everywhere. And through that chaos, Vlad pushed toward the center, toward the command tents, toward the Sultan himself. This was the most dangerous gamble of the entire campaign. If the Wallachians hesitated for even a moment, they would be surrounded and annihilated. They pushed forward anyway, cutting through isolated guards, striking fast, never stopping to consolidate. Ottoman elite forces began forming defensive lines. Steel clashed in cramped spaces between burning tents. Blades scraped shields. Men died under hooves. Firelight flickered across faces twisted with rage and confusion. For stretched minutes, no one knew which side was winning. Vlad pressed forward anyway. He had memorized the camp structure. He knew where he was going. Somewhere ahead, the Sultan was awake now, fully awake, protected by his best guards but no longer untouchable in his own mind. The illusion of safety, the assumption that size meant security, had been shattered. The window was closing. The Ottoman core was stabilizing. Vlad sensed the shift before it fully materialized and gave the signal to withdraw. The retreat was brutal. Some groups slipped away cleanly into the darkness. Others fought their way out blade by blade. In narrow lanes between tents, combat was intimate and savage. Men tripped over bodies. Smoke blinded everyone equally. Sparks burned exposed skin. Ottoman cavalry gave chase, but the darkness beyond the camp swallowed the attackers like water closing over stones. By the time pursuit could organize properly, the Wallachians were gone, scattered into terrain that Ottoman horses couldn't navigate safely in daylight, much less at night. When morning finally came, the scale of what had happened became clear. Men had been killed in their sleep. Guards had died without raising alarm. The center of the camp had been reached and touched. The Sultan's own position had been threatened. Mehmed didn't rage. He didn't need to. He understood exactly what this night had proven. No distance was safe. No formation was untouchable. No ruler was beyond reach. The army marched forward the next day. Orders were obeyed. Discipline held. From the outside, the Ottoman host still looked invincible. But something had broken inside. Men spoke less. Fires were watched instead of trusted. Guards didn't sit anymore. Even in daylight, laughter had vanished. And then they reached the capital. The road to Targoviste was short now. As the Ottoman vanguard approached, scouts slowed their horses. What they saw ahead didn't make sense at first. Then it did. Across the fields stretching toward the city, wooden stakes rose from the earth, hundreds at first, then thousands, and on every stake, a body. They were arranged deliberately, long ordered rows facing the road the army had to take. Some wore armor, some wore peasant clothing, some were Ottoman soldiers from previous raids. Many had been dead for days. Others were recent enough that the shapes of their suffering remained unmistakable. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a display. The vanguard stopped. Word traveled backward through the ranks faster than any command could. Soldiers halted, horses shied from the smell. Even hardened officers struggled to find words. Mehmed rode forward to see it himself. He didn't look away. He understood the message instantly. The stakes could be passed. The city beyond lay open and undefended. That wasn't the point. Every man who walked forward had to pass between the dead, had to smell them, had to imagine himself displayed there. Silent, erased, waiting. Inside Targoviste there was nothing. No defenders, no citizens, no supplies. The city had been emptied with the same ruthless calculation as the countryside. Food removed, storehouses stripped, streets silent. The army occupied the capital. Banners rose over empty buildings, but there was no celebration. The Ottomans held the objective they had marched to take, yet nothing felt finished. Vlad hadn't been captured. He hadn't surrendered. He hadn't offered terms. He had simply vanished, leaving behind proof of what he was willing to do, and how patiently he could wait. Holding an empty city solved nothing. Supplies had to come from hundreds of miles behind along roads that were never safe. Sickness spread. Every night still belonged to the forests. Every shadow still felt like it was watching. Mehmed considered his options. Staying longer meant hunger and constant erosion. Pushing deeper meant stretching an army already exhausted by a campaign that refused to follow normal rules. So the Sultan made a decision emperors don't announce openly. He withdrew. The Ottoman army marched south again, through a land that offered no comfort even in retreat. The campaign ended not with dramatic defeat, but with the quiet realization that this territory couldn't be held without paying a price far higher than it was worth. Vlad didn't pursue. He didn't need to. His objective was never to destroy the Ottoman army. It was to make occupation unbearable. And in that, he succeeded. His story didn't end happily. Politics and shifting alliances eventually brought him down. But across Europe, news of what happened at Targoviste spread not as a tale of conquest, but as proof that even empires have limits. That fear, properly weaponized, can hold back forces that seem unstoppable. Centuries later, his name survives in legend, twisted, simplified, transformed into something barely recognizable. But in 1462, there was nothing mythical about what happened. There was only a small country, a ruthless mind, and an empire forced to admit that power doesn't always move in straight lines. Sometimes it hesitates, sometimes it turns back, and sometimes it remembers a road it will never walk the same way again. If this story stayed with you, if you felt even a fraction of what those soldiers must have felt, drop a like below. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And if you want more stories where history gets dark and strategy gets brutal, hit that subscribe button. There's more coming.